Hi, welcome back to Ask a Creationist. I'm Todd Wood. I'm a young age creationist and president of Core Academy of Science, and I'm here to answer your questions about creation, science, evolution, the Bible, Genesis, theology, faith, whatever you got. We're interested in hearing from you. Drop us a line. Let us know what your question is. Maybe we'll feature it on a future episode. Don't forget to leave a like on this episode and subscribe. Hit that notification bell if you want to know when we're putting up our latest episode. Today's episode is all about this question. In the beginning, did God make all the species we have today? So maybe you've seen artwork like this painting from the 1500s, which depicts various scenes from the Garden of Eden. And as you look at the image, you will notice it contains pictures of lions and cows. There's a goat and a red fox, even a peacock. Lots of things that we're very familiar with today here in this image. Is this how it was? Is this the way it was supposed to be understood? Well, to answer that question, we sort of have to go and think about, well, what is a species anyway? Where do we get this idea of a species? What are we supposed to think about species and so forth? And the answer to that question is actually a little complicated because there are many different species concepts. They're not all the same. And yeah, these are basically different operational definitions that allow scientists to use this notion of a species when they're studying creatures. And underlying them all and historically looking through them, you will find that the basic idea is that members of a species breed true. That if you have two members of the same species, their offspring are going to look like the parents, right? So cats have kittens, cows have calves, and so forth. That's what happens. So the offspring looks like the parent. Now, we can trace this back to the 1600s. Here's Francesco Redi writing in his famous book on experiments on the generation of insects. I shall express my belief that the earth, after having brought forth the first plants and animals at the beginning by order of the supreme and omnipotent creator, has never since produced any kinds of plant or animals, either perfect or imperfect. And everything which we know in past or present times that she has produced came solely from the true seeds of the plants and animals themselves, which thus, through means of their own, preserve their species. So for Redi, the idea here is that we don't have wild changes from parent to offspring. What he was really dealing with in this book is spontaneous generation, the idea that rotting meat, rotting corpses would produce flies and maggots and that sort of thing. He said, no, what we have is that mommy and daddy flies and mommy and daddy worms and so forth produce baby flies and baby worms, and that's how things propagate. And so if you trace that very far back to the beginning, you will come to the original creation where God made the original members of a species. More famously, here's Linnaeus. Linnaeus is famous in the 18th century for listing species. He made the first big catalog of species of things, plants and animals. And he said in his Fundamenta Botanica, we count as many species as there were created forms in the beginning. So for Linnaeus then, things haven't changed. What you see now is what would have been there in the Garden of Eden had you been there to observe. And yes, Adam and Eve would have been there with a horse or a donkey or a tiger or a lion or an elephant or a giraffe and so forth. So that what we see now is essentially unchanged from the beginning. And this is sort of the standard, sort of stereotypical idea of what things were like before Darwin. And now Darwin came along, introduced evolution. No, species aren't created individually. They are evolved from common ancestors many, many countless years ago. But what most people don't know, what a lot of people don't know, I would say, is that that's not exactly how it went, right? That may have been the majority view, but there was a loud and persistent minority view. Even Linnaeus himself, studying these toadflax flowers, realized, those essential characteristics that I thought defined a particular species here of toadflax can change. And that means that the species themselves can change. And this was something that he realized later in his life after he'd written that passage in Fundamenta Botanica. And so then he began to think, okay, well, maybe species can change. Maybe God created a different category, a higher category, and that the species that we have, they're sort of adaptations. They're sort of variations that have arisen over time. And later in the 1700s, other scholars got into this same sort of thing. If you think that species are defined only by the way they breed, and that members of different species don't breed true together, well, then how do you explain this wolf-dog hybrid? And so, the guy writing this, doing this research and writing this paper reasoned, well, either we have to say that the wolf and the dog are all the same species, which he thought was unlikely because they're different. Or we have to conclude that species aren't really definable by their reproductive capacity, that you can have different true species that can breed true and produce viable and fertile offspring, which was difficult to understand from the notion of species of the day. And then, as breeding experiments went on, especially in the plants, that led to more and more people realizing that species are not constant. So here's William Herbert. He spent a lot of time in his spare time breeding amaryllis flowers. And this is 1837. This is 20 years before Darwin. And he says here, when I began many years ago to write concerning vegetables, I had to combat an idea that the Almighty had created each species of our botanical catalogues as it now exists, and that plants being able to breed together was the test of their identity as species. It has since been ascertained beyond dispute, as I then anticipated, that in some genera, all the species are capable of easy intermixture, and that even some, which botanists had erroneously placed in different genera, could produce a fertile crossbreed. Okay, so that's really, really interesting. So here, Herbert is basically saying, yeah, it's not the species, it's the genus. Genus is the next category up, right? You remember from maybe you remember from your high school biology or college biology class, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, that classification scheme. Genus is the next category up above species. So you have many different species in a single genus. And here Herbert says, yeah, the genus is more likely the actual created unit. And the thing that defines it is the ability to interbreed. And if you have two plants that can interbreed that are members of different genus, you must have put them in the wrong genera. So you have to lump those genera together as being a single genus. And in other passages of his book here, he talks about, well, where do these species come from? Well, they come from adaptations and acclimatization that happens after the flood. So the flood happens, and then things start, repopulating the earth and filling the earth again. And as they did so, they changed and acclimated to local environmental conditions. And when they did that, they became what we now think of as species. But the species are not the permanent types that God made. That's the genus. The species is just sort of ephemeral, and it can change over time. And again, this is 20 years before Darwin. And if you've been to the Ark Encounter, if you've been to the Creation Museum, this should sound familiar to you. That's basically the idea of the created kind today. And so, my goodness, yeah, this is almost 200 years ago now. This is 190 some years ago. And this guy is basically advocating the same sort of thing, the same kind of science that you find creationists advocating today. It's pretty amazing. So, how then, if that's true, if science went through this phase of thinking first that species could breed any sort of offspring that you could imagine, followed by a phase of no, species always breed true and they go right back to creation by God, followed by a phase of, well, maybe the genus is really the created unit, followed by a phase of, everything's related to a common ancestor. How did the species get associated with the Bible? Why is it that we just naturally think that when the Bible says, God created recently, that necessarily means that if you'd been in the garden, you would see a horse and a donkey and an elephant and a giraffe and the modern species that we have today? Well, the answer goes back to a particular Bible, and that is the Latin Vulgate. So when the Latin Vulgate was translated, this was very early on, they came to that Hebrew word mean in Genesis 1, which is translated kind in our English versions. And when it's talking about the creation of animals, they use the word species. I've circled it right there on the front page of the Gutenberg Bible. Species. And so this word actually comes from Greek philosophy. And so using this word brought in all this baggage from Greek philosophy. And in Greek philosophy, you had basically ways of categorizing where you had a genus, which was the category, and then you had a species, which was the specific instance. And the specific instance, the species, was differentiated from other species by very specific, essential attributes that don't change. And so all of this stuff from Greek philosophy then gets sort of ported in by default into thinking about what the Bible is actually saying. So if we go back to that question again, the original question, in the beginning, did God make all the species we have today? Well, there actually isn't really any biblical reason to think so. And historically, there's really good reasons to think that maybe that's not what the Bible had in mind when it was describing this original creation. Now, you might be thinking, if there's no biblical reason to think so, what about the biology? Go into the biology now. Well, unfortunately, this episode is done, and we're going to have to deal with that question in a future episode. But come back, and I guarantee you we will talk about the biology of species and how the sorts of evidence that we have that species are not fixed. But thanks for listening to this episode. Check us out at coresci.org/connect. There you'll find links to all of our social media where you can contact us. Also, you can contact us sending an email to info@coresci.org. Coresci.org/connect will also give you links to ways to support our ministry, Core Academy of Science. You will also find links to other ministry outputs that we have, including my blog, my Patreon, and the Let's Talk Creation podcast that we are co-sponsors of. So please do check us out there. And remember, if you've enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you didn't enjoy this video, leave a like anyway. And we'll see you next time.